Good afternoon and welcome to K2's Road to Excellence Part 8 and our partner Adagio by SoftTrack. This is Alan Salmon and spring is almost here in Brampton. And I know that because they started cutting our lawn yesterday and Nancy says there is one daffodil up so far, but I still haven't been able to go out on our gorgeous deck. So let's get down to business. A little bit of admin as usual. Marilyn Benninger is backing me up today, and she is your go-to person for technical issues and for questions. Your microphones are muted for obvious reasons. You're welcome to take notes, but be aware that within 10 days of today, Marilyn will be sending you a package, and in that package will be the recording of this webinar, my extensive teaching notes, my teaching files, and the answers to your questions, plus your CPD certificate. And speaking of questions, you ask them in the chat window. After today's webinar, Marilyn will copy them out and send them to Andrew and myself. We will send her back the answers, and both the questions and the answers will be in your package. And then for those of you that are new, the important thing is your CPD certificates. 5 times today, Marilyn is going to stop Andrew and myself and put up a polling question. And that's nothing more than a multiple choice question. You don't have to get the questions right, but you do have to click on one of the answers and click on submit, because that timestamps your file and we know that you're in attendance. And if you are recorded as getting at least 75% of the questions submitted, you'll get a CPD certificate for 1 hour of verifiable CPDs. If you don't, it'll be 1 hour of non-verifiable. And now on to today, a favorite topic of mine, the first of 2 sessions on pivot tables. And Marilyn, it's time for the first polling question, please.
Absolutely, Alan. Good morning or good afternoon, all, wherever you might be across the country. I'm launching the poll now. Your screen should be turning blue, and it's a question. What has been your experience with pivot tables? You can select more than one choice, if appropriate. Never used them, tried to use them, but had issues. Use them all the time. You format your data before you create my pivot table, or maybe none of the above, in which case you're in the right room for Alan's teaching today. We keep the polls open until we see 90%, and everybody is quick off the mark today. So I'm going to count you down to close in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm closing the poll and sharing the results.
Marilyn, you'll have to read them off to me. My second computer ran out of juice about 5 minutes ago.
No trouble. Most popular answer, 41%. Tried to use them but had issues setting them up. 25% have never used them. 30% uses them all the time. 13% formats their data as a table before creating the pivot table. And 3% of the folks on the call today have never used a pivot table at all.
Well, that's a great balance. So for the group that have never done them, I'm going to bring you up to the intermediate level. For the group that have problems, I hope I'm going to solve them. And we'll go from there. So what you're looking at is my first Excel spreadsheet, right, Marilyn? So what have we got here? Well, we got 3 columns of data, and we've got 109 rows of data, and typically organized in columns and rows. We call that a data set. And that's the way a lot of data is either produced or comes out of another program. If I need to ask questions about this, in other words, for example, how much 1-inch galvanized pipe did we sell in a year? I could do it by using subtotals. I could use it by using filters, or I could create a pivot table. And the name for a pivot table is very simple. It is a summary report like this. There we go. So that's kind of cool. You'll notice that we have all the products down column A and the sales of the products by month going across, grand total in column N and grand total in row 14. The other thing you'll notice when I click on here is that I don't have any formulas here. So Excel is doing the summing and the organizing in the background, and all I see is the results. The same thing here and here. All right, so now that we've done that, why don't we do something really cool, and let's create a pivot table. And once again, we have data in columns and rows. I don't think I have as much data here. Let's do a quick check. No. Oh, I do, 431 rows. All right. So we follow our nose. We go to Insert, and we go to Pivot Table. And we click. Now, something very important. You'll notice there that Excel figures out that my data runs from A1 to E431. I'm going to cancel that, and I'm going to go out here, and I'm going to click on Pivot Table. And you notice it's blank. So this is rule number 1 in creating a pivot table. Before you go to Insert, click on any cell inside the pivot table, and it doesn't matter which one. Then we go to Pivot Table, and there's our answer. Now, to be honest, I could put the pivot table over here. I never have, because I want it in a new workbook where it stands out by itself. So I click on OK. And I get this rectangle here, and that's where my pivot table is going to be created. And over here, I get what are called the pivot table fields. Pivot table fields are no more than the columns in my data set: date, check number, amount, vendor, account. So I need to decide how I'm going to display this information. And normally I will display the vendors, in this case, down column A. So I click on vendor, and voila, there's my vendors. Now I want to use the dates across here. So when I first started doing this way back before some of you were born, I said, well, that's cool. If I want a date, I'll just click on the box. So understand the basic rule here. If I click, it just adds it in column A. So plan B is we take the date column and notice the four-headed monster, the 4 arrows, left mouse click and hold, and drag it down there. And there's my dates. So now in here, what do I want? I want the sums. Well, I click the amount, left mouse click, hold and drag it down here, and voila, we have a pivot table. And it's easy as that. Now, yes, we can make it more complicated and we can do stuff with this, and that's where we're going to go from here. But before we do that, you notice that I did that even with the explanation in probably a couple of minutes, and we had 400 rows of data. Well, let's go to this file here in this data set, and let's see how many rows of data we have. Well, we've only got 91,053 rows. And for those of you that work with pivot tables, if I ask the question, how much longer will it take to create this pivot table? The answer is, depending on what you do, no more than 15 or 30 seconds longer than the one that I just did. And let me prove it to you. So I'm going to get inside here, which I am. I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to go to Pivot Table. And notice A3 and 9153. I'm going to do it in a new worksheet. Click on OK. Now, what takes the additional time is I've got a lot more columns. So what do I want in my first column? I want region. Okay. And what do I want in the column quadrant down below? Well, how about the order date? There we go. And what do I want for here? I want the sale amount. And there's our pivot table. Did it take any longer? Well, maybe 10 seconds. So the beauty of a pivot table is I can take tremendous amounts of data like that and consolidate it into a summary report in a very short period of time. And by the way, once, just for the sake of doing it, I created a pivot table from 1 million rows of data. Did it take any longer? No. So let's move on. And we're going to move on to here, to a pivot table problem, or as I call it, a pivot table trap. Now, this is the first example that I showed you with one small difference, and I'm not going to show you the difference until after we're done. So inside we go, and we go to pivot table, and we go here. And we click on product, we drag months down, and we drag sales down. Now, in 2016, or Office 365, this pivot table works perfectly. If you're running 2007, 2010, 2013, I draw your attention to this cell right here, which is blank. In 2007, 10, 13, you will not be able to, if you create a pivot table, you're going to get funny results because instead of a sum, it's going to do a count. Now, if we do this and have this situation and this situation, and I create the pivot table with this range like that and go to insert a pivot table, I get this result. The pivot table field name is not valid. To create a pivot table report, you must use data that is organized a list with label columns. In other words, you can't have a blank column here. And if you have a blank row, you'll get interesting results. Now, part of that problem has been fixed in Excel 2016, and that is that when you have, and I'm going to just do an undo here, when you have this situation, it's not an issue. In the prior versions, it'll give you a count, which I'm going to show you how to change in a minute. So that's the first pivot table trap. When I do my next session in 2 weeks, I'll show you some more. So now that we've got a pivot table and I've hidden the underlying data, let's see what we can do with it. So first of all, I want you to look up here in that area right there, and you notice there's nothing there. Watch what happens when I select any cell inside the pivot table. I get pivot table tools. And when I click on it, I get 2 different new tabs, Analyze, which we'll come back to, and Design, which is where I want to go now. When I click on Design, in here I get Pivottable Styles. So if I click down here, I get different styles. And the beauty of these is that as I hover over them, notice the background changes, the style changes, and so on. So you've got a lot of flexibility. I'm not big on the really dark ones like these. And my favorite is this one. And you're going to say, what? Well, this is Alan Humor. Did you notice the color of rows 1 and 2 and the lines on row 10? That's salmon colored. And no, I'm not going to tell any more jokes. So the beauty of this, as I said, is you can have this any way you like. All right. The next thing that we can do is this. Notice row headers here. Watch what happens when I unclick this. And I click it again. Actually, really nothing happens. But if I click on the column headers, watch what happens. Now, I don't know why you'd want to do that. There must be a reason. And then over here, we got two interesting things. Banded rows, and notice it puts a line there to differentiate the rows, which is very helpful when you're going across. And then we can have banded columns. Notice the lines are down. And depending on the design I use, things will get changed. So I'm very big on banded rows and banded columns. Let's move on to this. Now notice here that I have some different products or not vendors, but different items here. Beverages, food, supplies, and so on. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could group these, which we can absolutely do. Notice I've selected those two, and I'm going to right mouse click. And when I do that, I get this. And notice I have a group here. Wow. So notice in group 1, I have beverages and food. And I can change this. And let's change this to products. And then we have insurance, rent, utility expense. And notice that I'm clicking on those and holding down the control key. And watch what happens now when I go to group. Group 2, fixed costs. And we'll leave payroll expense and so on. Now let's go up here to here and right mouse click and go to group. That's interesting. We can actually group to seconds, minutes, hours, days, month, and quarters. And we currently have it as months, as you see up at the top. Well, what happens if I want to show it as quarters? Well, we click on quarters and we click on month to unselect it and we go OK. Beautiful. And we could do years and so on. So there is grouping. I can do them two ways. I've done a custom group here and I've done a date group here. So there's a different type. That's the same file, but I've formatted it, grouped it different into food, leaseholds, and payroll expenses. But there's something obviously missing here that I usually need, and that is, what are the subtotals for these groups? And that's amazingly easy to do. But before we do that, I'm clicking inside here and going up to the pivot table tools and going to design. And over here on the far left, I have some cool things. The first one is this, and that is a variety of ways that I can lay out the report. The default always is compact form, and that's the way you see it here. So the groups like food are on a separate line. If we go to the outline form, Notice now it's broken column A into the group names and column B into the items within the group, but food leaseholds are still on a separate line. If I go to tabular form, which is the way I normally work, I get this. So notice that extra line has gone, but I still have it in 2 columns. So that's the way of dealing with that. But if I click on here, I have 4 choices. Off for rows and columns. No totals here, no totals there. And if we go here, on for rows and columns, on for rows only, the total's way over here, and on for columns only. So typically you're going to want to go here to on for rows and columns. That has still not solved our subtotals. But gee whiz, we got a subtotal icon. What are our choices? Do not show subtotals. Show subtotals at the bottom of the group. Cool. And while I'm on here, notice what it's done now. Okay. Not only has it done my totals, but it has broken it down by quarters. And I'm also showing months. See the minus sign? Bye-bye the months. Bye-bye the months. Bye-bye the months. And so on. Well, the other way we might do it is show them at the top of the group. But we won't do it because I need to expand these. Which I'm about to do. And we'll go over here to there. And now we've got, when I go to this type, now you see my totals are here. Typically, we're going to have subtotals at the bottom of the group like that. Remarkably easy. All right, I want to do one more thing, and that is this. So this is the pivot table data that we started out with here, and here's the finished pivot table. Now we can't change anything in a pivot table, so if I click on 0, you notice what I get. So if I want to update it, I've got to go here. And I'm going to make this very visible. I'm going to make this 100,000. There we go. And we go back to the pivot table and nothing's changed. And it won't change until I select one of the cells in the pivot table and right mouse click here. So I get this window and notice what it says. Notice we've got 100,000 there. Now, let's do this. And let's take this data and do a copy and add it to the bottom. Let's go back to the pivot table. Actually, what I'm going to do here is change this to 5,000 and change this down here where I added it to 100,000, so it's very clear to you. And there we go. Now we go back to the pivot table and we right mouse click. And there's no 100,000 there. Why? Because it still thinks that the boundaries of the pivot table haven't changed. So I've got to tell it that I need to make the change. So I will go back to the pivot table, anywhere here, go to the pivot table tools, go to design, analyze, and go to change the data source. So it still thinks it's at row 109, but let's change this to row 112. Okay. And there is my 100,000. So it's a lot of work because our pivot table data sets tend to grow. So here's the magic solution. Before I will ever create a pivot table, I will do this. I will go to Format as Table, do that, and do that. Now, for those of you that have sat in on my tables, now as I add data, either here or at the bottom, my table boundaries grow. And that means that when I create a pivot table, all I have to do is do refresh as I add rows. I don't have to change the boundaries. So my last cardinal rule for today is I believe that you should always turn your data set into a table and then create the pivot table. And on that note, Marilyn, I need my last poll.
Absolutely. And we're getting a lot of great questions, folks. Thanks for that. People are learning a lot today, Alan. So here's your second of 5 questions. More advanced pivot table topics. Are you feeling more comfortable moving on? Have you ever done a consolidated pivot table? Do you create pivot tables from multiple sheets? Or do you create pivot tables from multiple files? There still might be some for whom this question is not applicable, and that's great too. So we just need a few more responses to get to our 90% threshold. I'm going to count you down from 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and I'm going to close the polls and share the results. So, Alan, are you powered up, or do you need me to read the results?
Read them.
So 79% are more comfortable with pivot tables. That's great news. 7% have done a consolidated pivot tables. 13% can create a pivot table from multiple sheets. 8% can create a pivot table from multiple files, and there's 14% who are looking for more information. I think I know where you're going with that.
And this will be the topic of the main topic of my session 2 weeks from now. So I'll thank you now, and I'll be back at the end. So it's time to hand off to my good friend, Andrew Bates. Marilyn, take it away.
My pleasure. Andrew, I'm handing you the call.
Thanks. So, thank you, Marilyn. And I'll just, interestingly enough, I'm ready to go. We'll see whether the right PowerPoint comes up. And I was chatting away to you with my mute button on my own phone. So always a pleasure taking part in these seminars. That was really interesting, Alan. And I hope that in the presentation today that we have an opportunity to talk even further about tables and pivot tables and some of the other features in Excel, because today we're going to talk about how Adagio integrates with Excel. Now, so just for those of you for whom this is a first-time attendance, you may not have heard of Adagio before. It's a multi-user, multi-currency, modular accounting system. It's designed to be the next logical step after an organization begins to outgrow one of the entry-level products like Sage 50 or QuickBooks. It's sold by module, so if you just need a general ledger and accounts payable because you're a small not-for-profit and you want to do departmental accounting with a lot of departmental analysis and budgeting by departments and excuse me, reporting by departments, you can just install the general ledger and accounts payable, but we have full specialized solutions for wholesale distribution and job costing and time and billing, professional time and billing, and those types of organizations. When we say looking for wholesale distribution, that Adagio Inventory has 5 separate costing methods: average, LIFO, FIFO, standard costing, and user-defined costing. It supports virtually any kind of pricing structure you would like to set up with your clients. So it's designed for business-to-business sales. The financial reporting is extraordinarily powerful, as well as the custom reporting applications that are available to help you get additional information out of your accounting software. We are batch-based because as organizations grow, batches provide control points in the accounting department. If it's just you doing the data entry, you can make pretty much anything run, including just linked Excel spreadsheets, because you do the entry, you do the coding. If a report comes out and it doesn't include a number that you don't expect, you don't have to go. Probably you will remember where the data was probably misentered, and it'll make it easy for you to find the transaction. But if you have a staff member who's doing the data entry and you print out a financial statement and go, well, that number cannot possibly be right, then you have to go and figure out where the transaction entry went wrong, and that can often be quite a major task when your transaction volumes grow. We're designed for organizations managing 2 to 100 million in revenue. We have some really big organizations running on Adagio. It's really more about the transaction volume. Over 30% of our clients are in the not-for-profit space because they're subject to audit, and that means that the accounting department is reporting to various different masters, to operational departmental managers, to government agencies, to funding agencies, to board of directors that have different needs for how they want the numbers presented. So the reporting flexibility within Adagio is usually seen as one of its strengths. Over 200 First Nations organizations run on Adagio. We have wholesale distribution company townships. You can see from the slide where our market segments are. The thing that differentiates Adagio is that organizations running Adagio tend to have a full-time accounting department or person. Actually, over 2/3 of our sites have more than one person in the accounting office. They tend to have a controller or CFO and an AP clerk or AR clerk or AR clerk. They know someone. They employ someone who knows the difference between a debit and a credit, who doesn't need a picture of a check in order to write a check. They have no IT department. So we tend to get installed in organizations that are not so large that they can support a full-time IT guy. Some of our larger sites do, of course. But generally, they look externally for IT support. They've subcontracted out their network management and protection, and they call someone in when there's a new employee that needs a workstation set up or needs to be added to the network. And most of our sites are report driven. So they've got to the stage where people are coming into the accounting department and saying, well, I just have a quick question. I'm sure you've never had that come in, I just have a quick question. And, one of the problems with quick questions is that there's no quick answers often. And so the question does not necessarily reflect how much work is going to be involved in actually answering the question. So we'll show a little bit today how Adagio's integration with Excel makes it possible to get fairly quick answers to those questions. So let's see what we got here. Whether I'm not going to the right. Not going to the right slide. I was playing with this the other day, and okay, well, let's just talk about Excel. And I'll put up the first poll here because Excel is the most popular accounting module on the planet. It's used wherever the accounting software that you're running does not perform some function. So one of the questions that I have for you is, how frequently do you rely on a spreadsheet or on Excel to do some functionality which you kind of wish was in the accounting software, or to do some further analysis on the numbers? So we'll let this run for a couple of minutes, not minutes, because minutes are forever, as anyone who's watched an NBA game knows. So we'll go and wait for a few people to answer. So in my experience, Excel is the most popular accounting module on the planet. I've talked to people who do all of their accounting in Excel. Almost every accounting department has some accounting functionality sitting in Excel, whether it's accruing vacation entitlements for the employees, or maintaining a fixed asset list, or doing a depreciation calculation. They're doing something in Excel, or budgeting, of course, is the most logical thing. So let's bring up the poll results. I'll close this and share this with you. As I kind of expected, well over half of you couldn't live without Excel. In the 20 years or so, 30, well, it's getting closer to 25 years now that I've been talking to people who work in accounting departments. I've had, in all of the people I've talked to, I have actually only met one person who has never used a spreadsheet. And it did occur to me that it was hard to imagine working in an accounting department without knowing how Excel worked. So let's talk a little bit about Excel and how Adagio integrates with Excel. So Adagio presents all of its information in a grid. And on most of the grids in Adagio, you see this button with an old Excel logo. It's an Excel 2003 logo because that's when the feature was first introduced. But we integrate with all versions of Excel. I noticed Alan was doing his presentation in the most recent version of Excel, and I thought that to make people feel better, I would use an older version of Excel, Excel 2010, just so that you know that there's still people out there who find that more than adequate. I will say, since I'm going to show it in 2010, I will say to those of you who are holding on, desperately unwilling to upgrade to a current version, that there are so many powerful new features, fabulous new features in the current versions of Excel that you should seriously consider moving to Excel 2016 or Office 365. So this Excel Direct button will take whatever you are looking at in the grid and drop it into Excel. Now, this could be your chart of accounts with the current balances and budget figures. You could drop those into Excel, or if we were looking at accounts receivable, you could, so this is the accounts receivable customer list with the balance outstanding, and I can click on the Excel Direct button, and Adagio will launch Excel, whatever version that you have, and will drop the grid that you are looking at in a table, already formatted as a table, so that you can work with this as doing all the things that Alan showed, easily sorting columns or filtering columns. So I would like to see all the people where the balance is greater than $1,000. What did I do wrong there? Number filters. Oh yeah, well, it did that for me. These are all the customers that owe more than $1,000. I could make it $10,000 to make it a little more visually apparent. As greater than 10,000. Okay, so there's the people who owe more than $10,000. And because we drop the data directly into Excel, formatted as a table, it's useful the instant that it's in Excel. So you can start doing analysis right away. You can answer that quick question, the how much or how many question, really easily by deciding what needs to be on the grid, and then because all of the grids in Adagio, virtually all of them, are customizable. You get to choose what fields are on the grid. So if someone comes into the office and says, we're thinking of changing the compensation strategy for our sales, can you give me a summary of sales by salesperson for last year? That's as easy as coming into the grid, saying that you want to add salesperson, and last year, invoice totals, and invoice counts. I'll take the balance outstanding off the grid. Okay. So now I have salesperson on the grid. I have the interest total, which is not quite what I wanted. I want the invoice total for last year, and I want the invoice count for last year. Okay. Invoice total last year, invoice count for last year. I've got the salesperson. I can drop this into Excel, and then I can go to Excel. I've already got it set up as a table, and I can say, summarize this with a pivot table. I want to summarize salesperson, invoice total last year. And there's my summary totals for whoever asked me for that number. Because that took me just a couple of seconds, I can add a chart for whoever's whoever wants to look at these numbers, because they're not very numerically literate. I can filter out the salesperson who has no sales from last year because they didn't work here last year, and email that off to someone. There was a question about I don't like this formatting. I want to change the formatting of these numbers. If you want to change the formatting of all of the numbers in the pivot table, go over to the right-hand side and choose value field settings. Choose the button number format. I would like this to be a number with thousand separator. Okay, and there's the numbers all changed to look a little bit more presentable. So here, I've been mostly showing really cool stuff in Excel, but the fact that you can get to this with 2 mouse clicks talks to the ease of integration or between Adagio and Excel. Every grid, virtually every grid in Adagio is customizable with all the fields from the data table that you're looking at available to be put on the grid, which means that you can customize every grid to every employee's specific needs for what they need to look at, whether it's the current balance outstanding or credit limit or last payment date or last payment amount or 30, 60, 90-day aging, all of which would be appropriate in accounts receivable, or maybe in inventory. You want to see the quantity on hand, quantity on sales order, quantity on purchase order, expected receipt date, all of those fields for a purchasing manager. Or in the general ledger, you want to see the budget and the actuals for a particular period. You can put all of those numbers on the grid, and someone can easily look at those numbers every day when they fire up Excel. Okay, so that's one way of getting data into Excel in Adagio, is the Excel Direct button. So one of the ways that I know that people have been getting data into Excel is they've been printing reports and then sending the report to Excel. So they go to a report and they print a detailed listing of a report. I'll print this is the operating account for cash. So I'm going to preview this report, and like most other full-featured accounting systems, we use Crystal Reports for our main management reports, and Crystal Reports has this nice export report, and I can take this report and export it to Excel. So there's a report. I'll export this report to Excel because they get requests from their auditors to please give me all the detailed transactions in an Excel spreadsheet. So they come in, they print the detailed listing, and they export the report. And okay, there's our report printed, and they're looking at this. Hang on a second. They're looking at this report. It's here somewhere. There's a detail listing. So they look at this and they say, oh, that's great. Except if you look at the columns across the top, look at all the columns across the top on this report. If I make these columns all the same width, format column width to, I don't know, 45. Let's make, okay. So if I do that and I make all the columns the same width, I realize that this report has hundreds and hundreds of empty columns that I have to remove or clean up in order to make this data useful for someone who's going to have to manipulate the data in Excel. So you can export the report out as a report, but then spend hours and hours making it tidy in order to make the data actually useful for analysis. So this kind of leads us to the next poll question. And the poll question is for you, when you're sending data from your accounting software to Excel, do you find that you have to spend significant time in order to reformat the data so that it's useful, or do you have to spend some amount of time actually tidying up the report, just so that so we'll see. Oh, so that's interesting. We're getting a few people who have written macros that will tidy up the report, and that's really excellent. That shows some pretty advanced Excel skills. So you have a report that gets exported in a particular format, and then you click a button on the toolbar, and Excel goes crazy, deleting all the columns and making them all the right size. And that's pretty advanced Excel formatting. So let's how are we doing? We're up to 85% here. We'll give people just a few more seconds to cast their vote, and then I'll close the poll and just share it with you so that you can see how your peers use this. So 23% of you, a quarter of you, actually are able to use the data directly, and that's good. I'm glad to hear that. And because the task of tidying up reports, almost half of you spend significant amount of time tidying up the reports. That's just busy work, and it's unfortunate that you have to do that in order to make use of the data. So we entertain so many requests for people to get report data into Excel, because now the reporting in Adagio is very powerful. You'll see I'm showing you the detail listing report dialog that allows you to choose how you want the data presented. You can see that you can choose the range of accounts and departments that you're going to print on the report. You can decide whether you want to see what order you want to see the transactions, source, date, description, or reference order first. So you can choose the ordering of the transactions. You can decide whether or not that you want to see the units of measure posted with the transactions. Do you want to see just the first description or the secondary description, or both? What range of fiscal periods you want? Do you want inactive accounts included in the detail listing, or do you want accounts that have had no activity in the periods that have been chosen? If we chose the year-end period, do you want to see year-end adjustments, that kind of stuff? So you can see there's lots and lots of flexibility in this report, and people wanted to be able to send this to Excel. So Adagio supports this Excel Direct Print option with an Excel Direct button on the print dialog. And if you say that you want to send this report to Excel, we will send the GL detailed listing with all of its options chosen. So what order the records are in, what information is displayed, what descriptions, but we'll flatten the report and drop it into a table. So it is useful the day that, or the instant that you get the information into the Excel workbook, you can make use of it right away without having to spend hours formatting. So if you wanted to just see period 10 transactions, you can say that and use the filtering, and then you would have totals down at the bottom. We put totals down at the bottom of the report so that all the filtering shows these totals of all the transactions. You see the debits and credits are posted, are in separate columns too. So that's a second way of getting information into Excel from Adagio using Excel Direct Print. Another thing that people want to get into Excel is they want to get financial statements into Excel. So the financial reporter in Adagio is a full spreadsheet with all of the computational horsepower of Excel. So there's very little need. You don't have to get financial numbers into Excel in order to do whatever presentation you want in Excel. Whatever presentation or calculation you want. You don't have to get those numbers into Excel because you can just do it in the financial reporter. But if you need to send this financial statement off to someone, then you can click on the Excel Direct button here, and we will send the financial statement out to Excel, and completely maintaining the formatting of the financial statement and also all the formulas. So if your financial statement has formulas in it, then we will maintain the formulas in the Excel sheet that we have sent. Now, you may have noticed that in the accounts receivable here, there's a little button with spectacles. Someone asked why we had handcuffs on here, but spectacles, which allows me to attach documents to a customer or to particular transactions. I can see the invoices that we've generated for a customer, or if there's been a cash receipt, I can see the cash, the scanned image of the check, and all of the invoices that the check was applied to. And those attached documents make their way all the way down to the general ledger, so that if I'm looking at the office expense here, and I drill down to see the transactions that have been posted, I can drill down to see for this account, this department, this fiscal period, and then the actual transactions. And I can keep on drilling down to see the balanced journal entry. So this is the balanced journal entry in the GL, and you notice that there's a view button here so that I can actually see the transactions that were the source of this particular journal entry. So that is a huge time saver if you're working in the GL and you're wondering, where this expense came from. You can just drill down and see the source document. Even if it was attached way up in purchase order, you can see the purchase order and the receipts and the invoices and the check that was printed and everything. You see that all the way down in the GL. Now, the interesting thing here is I can also right mouse click and just ask the financial reporter to show me all the transaction details that get me to this number on the financial statement. So 13,792, 13,792. And there's an Excel Direct button here, and I can take these transactions that were all the transactions across all the accounts and all the departments and all the fiscal periods that get me to a particular number. And then I can send those to Excel. And let's bring up Excel here. And you'll notice in Excel, I also can still see the document link. And if I click on the document link in Excel, Excel will bring up now. Excel only knows about Adobe PDF, so it launches Adobe Reader, but it can see the transactions. And if we go across to the directory where the data is being stored, you will see that not only here's the transaction details for that account. Here's the spreadsheet that we're currently looking at. The transaction details 6675. There's a spreadsheet, but underneath that spreadsheet, there's a folder, and inside the folder is all of the documents that have been extracted automatically in subfolders that will allow an auditor or someone external to the organization to actually find the transactions that are being linked to. So you can take the transactions, but maybe your entire year's transactions, drop them into a folder, drop them into Excel, drop them into a folder, and put them on a USB key and say to the auditor, well, here's my general ledger and all the source documents with the various approvals on it on a USB key for doing that. So we talked briefly about getting things out. In Adagio, you can also get things in from, or another way of getting things out is to export them. You can export every master file, every transaction file. The exports and imports are template driven, which means that if I tell Adagio how the format of the file coming in, what order the fields are coming, and what for those fields, you'll notice there's a filler button here. If the import file has an empty spot and you want to just skip that field in the import, you can have a filler. And for those imports where you're missing a value that the application wants, or you want to default a value for every single record that comes in, you can provide a default. So these templates can be set up, including with some overall options like auto deleting the file on success if you want, and auto import on startup. All of these imports can be automated, and exports. Imports and exports can be automated so that you, if you have some external application that's generating some Excel spreadsheet or comma separated value, you can automatically import those into Adagio without operator intervention. So our last poll of the day, always like to ask this question. Don't worry, we won't be harassing you. I'm just kind of curious, since you've seen what real integration with Excel can look like, and you're all running accounting software at some level, we're always kind of curious to see whether anything that we show actually generates an interest in or a consideration that you might consider changing accounting systems, because you can see that this functionality would save a significant amount of time or effort. So this is our final poll of the day, and I welcome your responses. I know that Marilyn watches the clock very, very closely. We have just a few more seconds before my time is up, and we'll give you 5 more seconds. We've got lots of people answering. I know that in my experience, people will give their own accounting software vendor 2 to 3 years to address a very significant pain point. So I'm not expecting a lot of people to say that they would, but it's very heartening to me to see that over 5% of you would consider replacing your existing accounting software to take advantage of the functionality that I managed to show you today. So Marilyn, I think that wraps up my presentation on how Adagio integrates with Excel. You're welcome to take the con back from me, and let Alan wrap it up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. As usual, you work to the clock, as I try to do. I want to say thank you to the group, and thank you to Marilyn for backing me up. If you're interested, 2 weeks from yesterday, I'm doing a session where I'll go further on. And by the way, Andrew, I want to thank you for covering some of what I'm going to cover in the next week. It's a good introduction. If you really want to get in depth on PivotTable, we have 2 paid webinars, and this information will be included when you get your package from Marilyn. And on that note, I'm going to say goodbye. It's a wrap.